Yes, I do want to remind you that we really do welcome your questions and comments for each of our speakers.
And please use the YouTube chat feature so that we'll be able to respond to your query in a Zoom session 1 week from now.
The formal introduction of our next speaker is by Suzanne Verge, another member of our team who is a non-directed donor.
But if you don't mind, Taryn, I'm going to tell our viewers a personal story, just like the other members of our team have done, right before we introduce the next guest. Because this speaker changed my life and served as the basis for everything we're discussing today. It is with the greatest pleasure that I bring up the name of Stephen J. Dubner, a well-known journalist who is the co-author of the popular Freakonomics book series, as well as the host of Freakonomics Radio. And it was while listening to his program on National Public Radio, in fact, Stephen's interview with Dr. Alvin Roth, that I was inspired to become a non-directed kidney donor and was motivated to found what was until recently known as Donor to Donor.
My name is Suzanne Verge, and I'm a proud member of the National Kidney Donation Organization, formerly known as Donor to Donor. I was a non-directed kidney donor, and I started off a chain of donations. I was inspired to be a non-directed donor after listening to a Freakonomics podcast with Stephen J. Dubner and our founder, Ned Brooks. It is an honor for me to introduce our next speaker, Stephen J. Dubner. He is an award-winning author, journalist, TV, and radio personality. He is the co-author of the Freakonomics book series, which has sold millions of copies in 40 languages. He's the host of Freakonomics Radio, which gets 10 million global downloads every month. He has taught English at Columbia University, where he received his MFA, and he has also played in a rock band, which started at Appalachian State University, where he received his undergrad degree. As a writer, it first began at age 11 when he was published in Highlights for Children. He lives in New York with his wife and children. It is truly an honor to introduce Stephen J. Dubner.
Stephen, you are a most accomplished individual in the art of communication. Whether as author, speaker, podcast host, you have a talent for finding the kernel of a concept and exploring it to the great pleasure of your readers and your listeners, and you educate as well as entertain, a special talent. To say that you've had an impact on my life is quite an understatement. My wife and I were driving in our car 5 years ago when we heard your Freakonomics podcast with Professor Al Roth, the Nobel Prize winner whose work helped create something known as a kidney chain, where a living donor without a directed recipient can kick off a chain of transplants, thereby introducing the concept of leverage to transplant. When I heard that my one kidney could affect multiple transplants, I was hooked and donated my kidney shortly thereafter. And I was not the only one to be so affected by that podcast. I have since heard from many individuals who are motivated by Al's interview to become donors. Your podcasts span a wide range of topics connected to a lesser or greater degree by an economic sensibility. So let me start by asking you to talk about how you and your team gauge a story or theme as a worthy subject for a podcast.
Thank you, Ned. First of all, thanks for doing this. I think this is an extraordinary effort, and I love that you're continuing to use the concept of leverage here to help more people. I would say that how we choose an idea is borderline random and unpredictable, which is to say that, I don't have a job. This is my job. It's not like I have to confine my thinking or confine my creative time to certain hours. One of the beauties of not having a job, I will admit, is not just not having a boss, which is big, but not having meetings, because I know that meetings are often necessary, often not. But I think there's sometimes a substitute for thinking, and I try to spend as much time as I can really thinking, keeping your mind open and available, whether you're reading, whether you're talking to other people, just basically constantly searching for ideas. And so the ideas that we try to do with Freakonomics Radio are ideas that are obviously true. We're nonfiction, so it's journalism. That's important. We're not just telling stories that happen to be appealing. I particularly look for ideas that are rooted in data and empirical way of thinking about the world. My favorite kind of subject to work on or episode to work on is one where I might read a paper and some researchers have found an academic finding that is just so interesting. You just want to know more and flesh it out and so on. But really the ideas come from anywhere. The one kind of cautionary component we always have is that it has to be truly interesting. And it also needs to be underserved. I don't want to chase the same story that every newspaper and TV newscast and podcast is chasing. I like to try to bring a little something different to it. And then you have to like the idea enough that you're not going to get sick of it, because our podcast, even though we're a weekly show, typically the germination of an episode begins 2, 3, sometimes 6 months earlier. Then there's research, you're preparing for the interviews, you do the interviews, you rough cut, you write a script of narration around it. So you're with this material for a long time. So you better be truly interested in it, because you have to stay focused and attentive and creative up till the very end. So that's where the episode that you heard that inspired you to donate your kidney with Al Roth, I mean, that's a no-brainer. Al Roth is, in my opinion, a really wonderful thinker and doer. And those two don't often travel so well hand in hand. We know a lot of people who are great at rhetoric and they're not so good at execution. We know some people who are good at execution and not good at rhetoric, but if you can find that magic combo, that's really something. So that's that. As special as that episode was for you and for this whole community that you've built, it was also very special for me.
Great. So there are roughly 100,000 people on the wait list for a kidney transplant and only 6,000 to 7,000 living donors each year. The majority of the viewers of this and the other videos on this conference are engaged in advocacy for living donation, most of whom are either organ donors or recipients. Your interviews are measured and balanced as you explore different sides of an issue, but let me ask you to offer up some advice about communication in a general way, which might help these volunteer advocates to be more effective in generating interest in living donation.
Well, I think one of the saddest lessons I've ever learned, and this is a result of many years of writing and researching and thinking and so on, is that just because something is the right thing to do doesn't mean that A, a lot of people will necessarily do it. And it also doesn't mean that B, even if other people agree it's the right thing to do, that they will really act on it. There's a lot of virtue signaling in the world. Twitter is probably 80% virtue signaling. I want to show that I'm on the right side of this argument or on the right side of history. Well, I think that, again, it comes down to rhetoric and execution. Rhetoric is useful. Ideas are incredibly valuable, but execution really wins the day. So what I would say is that given the disparity between the demand and the supply that you just sketched out, it's pretty obvious that despite all the good intentions, all the very hard work that people in this community have been doing, it's not enough. So sometimes you have to use the data to give yourself a good slap across the forehead and say, plainly what we're doing is better than zero, but it's not getting us to where we want to be. So what are our other options? And I'm sure that everyone in your community has thought that. If I were to pick one model of thinking for how to change that, how to shrink that gap, it would be a very simple one that I'm sure many of you have already considered, but if in case you haven't talked about it as part of this convening, I'll raise it, which is the notion of presumed consent as opposed to opt-in consent. So as I'm sure you know, in many countries in Europe, the donation rate for kidneys and other organs is much higher, in part because on your driver's license, you are presumed to give consent for the use of your organ, whereas here we have the opposite. We have an opt-in system. So obviously, if you set the default as yes, as opposed to the default at no, you're going to get more yeses. Obviously, also, people can opt out, and you need that choice. My favorite example, however, of how presumed consent changes lives by huge magnitudes is not necessarily from organ transplantation, organ donation, but from pension savings. So years ago, the economist Richard Thaler, along with a colleague, I believe it was Shlomo Ben-Artzi, looked at how pension plans were being used or often not used in the United States. And there was this period where the company pension, where the company used to do the pension for you, and that's long gone for the most part. But now people can set up their own pensions via their company. Sometimes the company will match some of the contributions and so on. And then you get to pick from these funds that the company will maybe administer that management and so on. But these economists saw that many people, many employees at firms were not taking advantage of this retirement savings, which was a good thing to do, and B, it was often free money from the company. And they said, why are they not doing it? And then if you dig down a little bit, you see the reason they're not doing it is because it's a pain in the neck and it's intimidating. So if you're, let's say, a new employee, you're a graphic designer, you're an electrical engineer, whatever you are, and you come in and your HR person gives you this envelope this thick, says, here's our pension plan, just fill out the forms, check the funds you want to invest in and so on, we'll get you invested. Then you go to those forms and it's 30 pages of forms. And then once you're in, you have to choose between 80 different mutual funds, and you don't know a value fund from a growth fund. That's not what you do. And so the economists thought, what if, rather than force everyone to go through this huge pile of intimidation and paperwork, what if we say, let's flip it. You're presumed that you're in. When you come join the company, you're in the pension plan. If you don't want in, you can opt out. Now, what they should do if they want to be fair is they should make the opt-out paperwork 30 pages also. But by doing that one simple, I say it's simple, it took them many years and a lot of legislation to make it allowable across most, I believe it's most states and most companies. And now this is a very, very, very common practice. And the result is that millions and millions of people have now saved billions and billions, maybe trillions of dollars as a result simply of flipping the switch. So you can see why I think that's a powerful concept when applicable. And I would argue that in the case of of organ transplantation, until we get to better solutions, until technology and science obviate the need for donated organs, I think that trying to advocate for and legislate for presumed consent with, let's say, traffic fatalities is a good idea, a good contributor at least to this effort that trying to close that gap between the massive demand and the small supply.
From what I understand, that's been quite successful in Europe. If the events of the last 4 years, the cultural events of the last 4 years are any indication, I've been in several discussions about the concept of opt-out, and there's a lot of paranoia, shall we say, associated with many people about that concept, that they won't acknowledge the fact that I'm opting out. They'll let me die so they can have my organs, so on and so forth. You get into some pretty strange territory when you talk with people on opt-out.
You do. And again, this goes back to what I said earlier about being right and having the facts don't necessarily win you every argument. But I find that it's a lot easier to make an argument when you have the facts that are right. So you're not going to win every time. But the fact is that those concerns, while some of them sound, more legitimate than others, of course there are concerns. Show me a piece of legislation ever that didn't have concerns. And this is where I would argue that economists have a useful model, which is the cost-benefit analysis. Everybody in business does this, but nobody in policy does it. It's remarkable to me. So if you run a business, you understand that every time you make a decision, There's a certain benefit you can expect, and it needs to be greater than the costs. And often the costs are not the same category as the benefits, right? The benefits may be money, the costs may be morale, whatever. So you have to equilibrate that. But the fact is that when it comes to making policy, we're not very good at applying cost-benefit analysis. We more typically apply, emotional hyperbolic analysis, which is, I hate that idea, or I love that idea, or you're an idiot for thinking this is a good idea. And so, you paid me some nice compliments earlier on by saying that I try to have moderated conversations about complicated issues. And I do. That's a choice. And, I hope that more and more people continue to make that sort of choice, because I think that we've all become convinced that the opposite is not very fruitful. The opposite kind of conversation of totally my way or the highway, all emotional, all rhetoric, all hyperbolic, no facts, no logic, etc. That doesn't produce a lot of gains. That might produce some gains for some people. But if we truly believe in humankind as a rising tide lifts all boats kind of community, which I would argue that most of us really do, I think that very few people really want to gain for themselves at the expense directly of others. I really don't think that's the case. But I think that when you frame every argument as a zero-sum game, I think it feels that way.
Well, you segue very nicely into my next question here. Incentives, economic, social, and moral, are the cornerstone of modern life, is a common theme in your books and podcast. And the mantra of knowing what to measure and how to measure it makes a complicated world less so is woven throughout your work. What has surprised you regarding human behavior and how people in general respond to risk versus reward scenarios? How do you square incentives with non-directed kidney donation?
Well, I mean, I'm the one that should be asking you that question, right? You're so nobody paid you. Yeah.
Well, I would say that the incentives to non-directed kidney donation are that at the end of the day, the kidney donor feels unequivocally that he or she has done the best thing he or she has ever done in their lives. And that is absolutely 99% of the people who donate their kidney feel that way. So there's something going on there that's meaningful.
Yeah, I mean, economists for years studied altruism in a laboratory setting, and other researchers before economists had done it. And they had this game that they play. It's called, there are a couple different versions. There's the dictator game, the ultimatum game, and basically they involve bringing a couple research subjects, usually university undergraduates, into a room and saying, I'm going to give one of you an envelope with $10 in it, and the other person doesn't get the envelope. And if you want to give some of your money to that person, you can. You're never going to actually see each other in this exchange, and the person won't know who gave it to you. Or the person won't know that you were the one that did them the nice favor by giving them a few bucks. What would you like to do? And most of us in that situation give a couple dollars. And that was determined to be the baseline argument that humans are inherently altruistic. Well, it turns out that wasn't a very good experiment. Turns out there are a lot of reasons why the average undergrad would give 2 out of his or her, let's say $10 in an envelope. First of all, it was a windfall, right? They didn't work for the money. Second of all, it's pretty obvious what's going on. There's some professor there measuring whether you're going to give or not. So you don't want to look like a total, cretin by keeping all $10. So anyway, so there were those who believed that was altruism. Then there were those who came in and looked at this experiment and said, that doesn't look like the real world to me. Like, I've never gotten on the subway or a city bus and said, I've got $10 in my pocket. I think I'm just going to leave 2 here. You might give 2 to somebody that you think is deserving, but you don't just sprinkle it around to people you don't know and so on. So the economists kept pulling this thread about altruism, and they came to the conclusion that you've come to, which is they don't call altruism per se anymore. They call it warm glow altruism. And this goes back to what I was saying before about costs and benefits. There's a huge cost to you or anyone who gives a kidney. Let's not kid ourselves. You're not just clipping your fingernails. It's more than that, right? What's the benefit? Again, it's a different currency than the cost but it can be massive. So that, I think, is a great example, really, of thinking about an incentive. What were your incentives? They're not the kind of thing that are easily measured. And this is, I would just make an argument here for the kind of work that we try to do and other people try to do, whether it's journalism or empirical research. Some of it is science and some of it is art. This is the blending of psychology and theology and philosophy on the one side, and mathematics and economics and even physics on the other side. And it's really important to unite those two different streams, because we need to be empirical and we do need to measure, but we also can't leave out of the equation the human psyche and what makes us happy, what makes us sad, what makes us fearful. For many, many, many years, too many economists measured economic thinking only by dollars and maybe by time, but not by emotion and feeling. And that I think is changing now. But, it's incredibly important to recognize the variety of incentives that people respond to, and also the fact that it can be really hard to predict which incentives will work and which don't. We think we know the answer, but it's not always the case. I do want to ask you, Ned, I'm curious to know, it's been a couple of years since we spoke about the recipient of your kidney, Danielle. Do you have an update on Danielle?
Yes, thank you for asking. When you and I spoke with Danielle for the first time, and I think it was February of 2016, she was doing very well. Shortly thereafter, probably a couple of months thereafter, I got word that the kidney that she had received from me was in the process of failing and ultimately did fail. And the reason for that was she had a heretofore undiagnosed illness that killed my kidney that they did not know about when they transplanted her. She was highly sensitized, well over 99%. So it was very, very difficult, very unlikely that someone would just walk into a transplant center as saying, I want to be the donor for Danielle, to be a match. It was really very unlikely. And so I viewed that as unfinished business. And I spent 3 years trying to find someone who would give Danielle a voucher through a system that the National Kidney Registry had devised, whereby a non-directed donor, an altruistic donor started a chain, can do that and then give an individual a voucher. And when that donor donates, then the individual who receives the voucher then goes to the top of the list for the next donor. Again, because Danielle was so highly sensitized, throughout the National Kidney Registry of nearly 100 transplant centers at that time, they were able to canvass the entire pool of donors and fortuitously found one person who was a miracle match. So the voucher donor, a lovely woman by the name of Betsy Snow, who is a member of our team, and her husband Peter is also a donor and also a member of our team. She gave the voucher to Danielle. Danielle got her kidney within 12 weeks after Betsy donated. So and she's doing very well. Thank you for asking.
Wow, that's I'm glad to hear that. That's some story. That is altruism. What we saw the college kids doing in the classroom was not, and I think we can recognize the difference. That's remarkable.
Well, I will tell you that this whole process has really muddled my thinking on what is altruism, because I'm something called a non-directed donor. Some people used to think of it as altruistic. I don't. I think of it as non-directed. Altruism to me is when you do something without any expectation of any benefit. Whereas when you donate a kidney, you know from talking to other people who've done it that it feels good. And in fact, it feels really good. And so I don't feel like I was shortchanged in this deal by any means. I feel like I got a lot out of it.
I hear you, but look, there's been a lot of theology and philosophy written about the highest forms of altruism throughout history. And if you think about it, it's impossible to do it for no self-gain unless you are sacrificing your life, at which point you lose consciousness and can't appreciate the benefit, right? So my favorite hierarchy of altruism was created by Maimonides, the Jewish sage from many centuries ago, who was also an MD, which I think is not coincidental. And if I have it right, and I may not, but if I have it right, he listed this hierarchy of altruism, and at the bottom of it, the least desirable form is the one where I give in order for people to understand that I'm altruistic, right? I'm going to give $1,000 to some organization and insist not just that my name be included in the program, but my name better be first, or else you don't get. Okay, so that's the worst. That's barely altruism. The highest form of altruism, however, if I recall correctly, was not to give money, not to give to a cause, was to provide employment for someone who was otherwise unemployed or maybe even unemployable. The reason being that there is no higher altruism than to give someone the ability to reclaim their self-agency. And I think that's a remarkable, again, we could debate this, whether that's actually the highest form of altruism. It's not for me to say. But I think that's an incredibly important and, for me, moving insight, because it really changes the dynamic between the giver and the recipient. And it really puts emphasis on the fact that we are all connected, that one who may be in surplus one day may be in deficit the next, and that the best you can do is to help someone restore their own ability and dignity, really, because that's what it's really about. It's about, if I can, dignity is theoretically in infinite supply in all of us, and replenishing someone else's doesn't deplete from your own. In fact, it might add to it. But that's not a concept that we really talk about a lot in public discourse. We're so transactional, we're so zero sum, but in fact, there are many benefits that we can accrue that are not zero sum and that are infinite. So I think you're a really good example of it. And I think probably most people on this, in this conference are a good example of that as well.
So, to get back to podcasts. Podcasts have exploded in popularity in the past few years, and the variety of subject matter is impressive. If my preferences are any indication, it seems that there is a first mover advantage to being one of the early ones. I have a stable of podcasts and limited time to hear them all, so it's becoming increasingly difficult to fit in a new one. Have you seen this as well, and what has been the effect on Freakonomics?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good observation. The supply of podcasts is growing much faster than the demand for podcasts, even though the demand has grown quite well. I mean, the demand has actually grown a lot. We've been doing this about 10 years now. Overall demand, I actually don't have that number off the top of my head, but I will tell you overall supply. When we started Freakonomics Radio, 2010, I believe there were maybe between 50 and 80,000 podcasts, many of which were essentially repurposed radio shows and things like that. Now, as of today, there are the most recent number I saw is about 1.3 million. So somehow you would need to have a similarly exponential growth in demand as there is in supply, and that has not happened. So it is true that if you are your standard issue, let's say B+ celebrity or CEO or sports figure, and if you had started a podcast 5 years ago, especially 7 years ago, you could just waltz in, put out something mediocre at best, and pluck 100, 200,000 listeners just like that. It was kind of easy picking. Now it's exactly the opposite. So you are right that the first mover advantage is real, and I'm glad that I have some, because if we were starting Freakonomics Radio today, we might do it. But the show that we produce is actually very labor and cost intensive. There's an idea, there's research, there's lining up, seeking out the best guests, there's rejecting some, accepting others. In the age of COVID, it's obviously more complicated. We bought 15 or 20 mobile recording kits that we now FedEx around the world constantly. We bring them back in, we sanitize them, we send them back out because everybody's recording at home. Then we record all these interviews. We usually end up with between, let's say, 3 and 10 hours of tape for each episode, which will be cut down to 30 or 45 minutes. So there's a lot of editing, there's scripting, there's music, da-da-da-da-da-da. It's very hard to imagine that we would do that same intensity of production today, because it would just be financially impossible. There's no way I could get anyone to want to underwrite that unless I were to do it myself, and it would be very expensive. Because we were successful and are successful, we can afford to do that. So I consider that a great privilege and great fortune. You know, I look at 60 Minutes has been on the air, whatever, 190 years now. And I look at how well they use their resources. You know, they spend a lot of money to do the shows, to do the episodes that they think are important. And I think that's a very that's a high calling to do that. So we try to do something like that. We have started a few new podcasts that are creating what we call the Freakonomics Radio Network. We've got 2 fully operational. We've got another handful underway. And I'll tell you, it's a different universe. So if you have any clues as to how to appeal to listeners, you know, because really you are asking someone, if you want to listen to my new show, you kind of need to give up something else. Maybe it's another podcast, or maybe like you're not going to read to your kids in bed at night anymore. And I don't think that's the trade-off that we're expecting people to make.
Well, Stephen, it has been far too long since we talked last. I cannot thank you enough for your time. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, and I'm a devoted Freakonomics listener and will continue to do so. Thank you for your time.
It's my pleasure. I admire what you've done from, you know, beginning to end with this project, and I really appreciate your letting me participate in this gang. I do, and I wish everybody on this in this group the best of luck with everything. Thank you.